Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, Thank you for joining us for today's program, Black Music in the Archive, a conversation with Professor Mark Anthony Neal of Duke University, joined by Wake Forest University's own Professor Shanna Greene Benjamin. My name is Corey Walker. I'm the Wake Forest Professor of Humanities and Director of the Program in African American Studies. And I want to thank you for joining us for today's exciting program celebrating the publication of Mark Anthony Neal's latest book, Black Ephemera, The Crisis and Challenge of the Musical Archive. I'd like to open up our introductions by reading one of the first paragraphs coming out of Mark's latest book. It is a paragraph that is emblematic of a hospitality, not only to the richness of Black expressive culture, but also to a capacity to welcome and host Black culture in all of its capaciousness, all of its depth, and in all of its variety. He writes, "When I had my first part-time job as a teen, I devoted more than half of my earnings to buying vinyl records from places like the Tower Records on 4th and Broadway, and J&R Music World, and Bondi's record store down on Park Road. My ultimate aim, however, was not collecting vinyl, but crafting and curating pause button mixtapes. For me, mixtapes not only reflected my love of music, but also the thought that went into constructing these sonic representations of my passions, desires, and moods." Mark Anthony Neal is the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of African American and African Studies at Duke University, where he serves as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies. He also holds professorships in the Department of English and the program of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. He offers courses on Black masculinity, popular culture, digital humanities, including signature courses on Michael Jackson and the performance tradition. He also co-teaches a course for over 10 years, over a decade, with our own, as well as Duke's own, Patrick Ninth Wonder Dalton, a Grammy Award-winning producer for the course, The History of Hip Hop. He is the author of several additional books in addition to the one we're celebrating today, including What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Popular Culture, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and the Post-Soul Aesthetic, and Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities. The 10th anniversary edition of Neal's New Black Man was published close to a decade ago in 2015, so we should hopefully get the 20th edition soon. And he's also co-editor of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader, now in its 3rd edition. We're working on the 3rd edition. Additionally, Professor Neal hosts the video webcast Left of Black. And if you are anywhere near the Academy, you've grown up with Left of Black and those amazing, stirring interviews that conducted by our guests. Left of Black is produced in collaboration with the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University. And of course, you can follow Professor Neal on Twitter at NewBlackMan and on IG at Booker DB Brown. Joining Professor Neal in conversation after he discusses his book, Black Ephemera, will be our award-winning professor, noted biographer and scholar of African American literature and Black feminist studies, Shanna Greene Benjamin. Professor Benjamin joined the Wake Forest University faculty as the first tenured full professor of African American studies in July of 2022. An accomplished scholar and academic leader, Professor Benjamin comes to Wake Forest from Grinnell College, where she was professor of English and associate dean of the college. Prior to her tenure at Grinnell, Professor Benjamin was a member of the faculty at her undergraduate alma mater, Johnson C. Smith University, where she also directed the university's Honors College. She is the recipient of a number of fellowships and awards, including most recently an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship and a Howard Foundation Fellowship. Her recent biography of the legendary scholar and literary critic, the late Nellie McKay, published under the title Half in Shadow, The Life and Legacy of Nellie Y. McKay, published by the University of North Carolina Press, was selected as one of the best reads of 2021 by Ms. Magazine and was recently awarded the Hurston Wright Legacy Award for Nonfiction in October of this year. We're so delighted to have this distinguished conversation where now Professor Benjamin gets to turn the tables a bit and interview Professor Mark Anthony Neal. So let's first welcome Professor Mark Anthony Neal.
I want to thank Dr. Walker for the invitation to hang with y'all today. This is my partner in crime, Knife One, who is under the weather with the flu. And I don't want to spend too much time me talking about the book because I'm looking forward to the conversation with Professor Greene Benjamin. But as Professor Walker began the book, and as I write in the opening section, I was a bit of a nerd. I grew up in the Bronx, South Bronx. Only child. My parents were big on music, different styles and listened to it in different ways. My dad was an album collector. So it was all these stacks of albums around the house, which I was told at a very young age never to touch. And his pride and joy, other than me, I guess, was his Fisher's Theory component set, which he bought in 1972, in which I was instructed never to touch. So much so that when I turned 8 years old, they bought me my own component set. So there would never be any accidents, in the house. My mother was more about 45s, easier to buy, stuff that she could buy with her own money. She tended to listen to male singers. There's a lot of Al Green in the house, a lot of Ted Pendergrass when he came on the scene. Her favorite vocalists, though, were Aretha Franklin and Pastor Season. My dad was an older head in terms of the stuff that he listened to. So he listened to a lot of gospel quartets. I grew up listening to Sam Cooke and Soul Stirrers and White Clouds of Joy and the Highway QCs, the Dixie Hummingbirds, the Swan Silvertones. I could go on and on with this. And then, his other listening were the Hammond B3 Jimmys, Jimmy Smith and Jimmy McGriff. And then a little B.B. King, a lot of Bobby Woodward. But my dad worked 6 hours a week. He's only home on Sundays, and so the Sundays the house was filled with his music. But I had to give you a layout of the tenement that I grew up in the Bronx. Maybe 650, 700 square feet. But in this space, in the living room, there were 2 mantle-like speakers about this high, opposite each other in the living room. In the kitchen, on top of a cabinet, was a smaller speaker. And in their bedroom was a 4th speaker that was hung on the wall. And so there was always music in the house, and my mother in particular wanted folks outside the house in the apartment building to know what she was listening to at any given time. And so there's a way in which this work that I've done, whether it's Black ephemera or the work that I've done in Black music more broadly, I didn't really have a choice. That was going to be my vocation before I knew it was a vocation. But the happenstance is that in 1971, I'm 5 years old. My father took me to see the Supremes, minus Diana Ross, in the Apollo. In October of that same year, my mother took me to see the Jackson 5, one of the early national tours. Michael was brilliant, as he was in that moment. And then together in June of that same year, Aretha Franklin did a week-long stint at the Apollo Theater. And they took me to see Aretha Franklin, opening with King Curtis. I was oblivious to any of that at the time. I was most interested, obviously, in the Jackson 5. I barely remember the Supremes other than the secret bands. And if you've ever been to the Apollo, right, for all the kind of prestige of the space, it's not a big space, right? There's no back seat in the Apollo. But then that Aretha Franklin comes. And that tour was part of the tour that was recorded as her live at the Fillmore West Side. The album that I would argue is her greatest album. Folks talk about Amazing Grace, and rightfully so. But what Amazing Grace eventually becomes, the starting point is Fillmore. 3 nights at the Fillmore West, which is Bill Graham's shrine to people like the Grateful Dead and Carlos Santana, right? Not a space that you actually heard a lot of Black acts. It was Jerry Wexler's idea that Aretha should do 3 nights there. And you know, Aretha's band at the time, Bernard Purdy on drums, Billy Preston was playing keyboard. Aretha, of course, herself was an amazing pianist. You know, all these great folks that you also hear in that Amazing Grace album. And, you know, the person who kind of captures those 3 nights the best is Billy Preston. He was asked, right, what was it like? Right? And, you know, the Fillmore West is all hippies. And Billy Preston just goes, the hippies flip the fuck out. I mean, that's his exact quote about those 3 nights. But what's so telling about those 3 nights is that, you know, in some ways, she introduced this crowd of young white listeners to the sanctified church. But she met them on a middle ground. So she covers Stephen Stills' Love the One You're With. She covers Brad's Naked With You. She does a version of Bridge Over Troubled Water, right? Covering Simon and Garfunkel. She does a version of, I want to say, The Long and Winding Road, which she had recorded before the Beatles released it, because Billy Preston had slipped her a tape on it. And she put it on one of her albums. And what you see in that moment is Aretha Franklin beginning to explore her mastery of American music. And I mention that in the context of this book because that was one of the things that I tried to do with Black. The book is broken into 5 chapters. When I was a kid, I made these little mixtapes. And as I talk about in the book, as a terribly shy and awkward Black boy from the South Bronx, I was more apt to give a young girl that I was attracted to a copy of one of my mixtapes than I was actually to try to talk to them. Right? Professor Greene Benjamin might have got a mixtape to put that in some sort of context, right? And for me, it was the love of bringing the music together and coming together with a kind of sequence so that you were listening to an experience, thinking that I could sequence the music better than the record companies did or radio stations did. And, you know, at 17 years old, I didn't know what an archivist was. I didn't know what intellectual property was. But at that young age, I was functioning as an archivist, right, and curating, right, a listener experience that I didn't understand, you know, that's what it was. And so in some ways, this is the book that I have been working on all my life, not knowing that I was someone who curated or was in archives. You know, my ideas of archives, you know, are stacks of paper and books, something in the library. I never thought of my parents' record collection as an archive. I never thought about my mother's 45s, right? And I still have parts of both of those archives, though, I don't listen to them. I never thought, when I was in graduate school working on my dissertation for my first book of music set, and did a Sunday morning program on the local radio station, campus station called Soul Expressions. And I would go into their archive, right? The stacks of these albums, some of which hadn't been played for 20 years. I liberated a great many of them, right? In the days before Spotify and streaming services where you could find anything. I didn't understand that was the work that I was doing. And this project actually started out as a project about Black folks and social media, Black folks and the internet. That's what I thought I was writing about. And at some point I realized, I had colleagues that were doing it better. I'm thinking about Jessica Marie Johnson in particular. And what my gift to this, what my contribution would be a conversation about this transition from Black analog culture to Black digital culture. So the first chapter, which is one of the earliest parts of the book that I conceived, is thinking about Stax Records. And the great Al Bell, who took over Stax Records after being a promoter for them for a long time, vice president, in 1968. And Stax had lost its archive. Not the way I would have described it when I first heard the story, but they had set up a bad distribution deal that if, Atlantic Records was ever sold, and Atlantic Records did the distribution of Stax, if Atlantic Records was ever sold, basically Stax's whole catalog would revert to Atlantic's ownership. So Al Bell takes over this record label in 1968 with Atlantic Records, right? Except for stuff that hadn't been released, and the way that he goes about rebuilding an archive of Black music. The first big success was Johnny Taylor's, Who's Making Love? Right? Song that Johnny Taylor hated. He called it the Boogie Boogie song because it was too fast. But it sold 1 million copies, right? Al Bell, who goes about this thing where he releases 29 albums in the span of June of 1969, what he called a soul explosion. Isaac Hayes, who was a songwriter at Stax with David Porter, wrote all the great songs for Sam and Dave, worked on almost all of those albums and said to Al Bell, I want to be able to at least do my own record. That record that he did was Hot Buttered Soul and changed the sound of Black music in that context. Right? So I wanted to write about that process. There was a wonderful little novel, experimental novel written by Ricardo Cortez Cruz. And it's a book that when I first read it, it challenged me because it really is using Black music culture as a way to articulate deeply embedded ideas. The book was published in 1993. It's called 5 Days of Bleeding. And it wasn't until the internet became a thing that I understood what he was doing. He was doing hypertext. So many of the characters were speaking in song lyrics, in particular the main character, a Black girl of 18 or 19 years old, was speaking the language of obscure Black women blues artists from the 1920s and 30s, right? And what Ricardo Cortez Cruz is asking you to do, that when they speak these lyrics, right? And again, this is before the internet, it would be like you should click on it, right? To expose yourself to this larger archive. And that is actually the practice that I did for that chapter. To be able to talk about some of these wonderful blues artists, right? To have a conversation, for instance, about the great Sarita Wright and Yvonne Wright, who are not related, but who were Stevie Wonder's muses in the late 60s, in the early 1970s. Sarita Wright, in fact, contributes about 32 songs on Stevie Wonder albums, the great albums that predate Intervisions. In the 1970s, when he marries and then breaks up with Sarita Wright, he begins a relationship with Yvonne Wright, who also contributes a lot to these albums. And the argument that I make about exploring this archive is that, in fact, the Stevie Wonder that we understand the genius as he is now as a songwriter. In fact, was engaged in an apprenticeship with Black women songwriters like Yvonne Wright and Yvonne Wright that helped him find his songwriters, right? Obviously, he's a musical genius, right? But what happens with Inner Visions and Songs in the Key of Life and, you know, Fulfilling This Personality is that his songwriting skill matches his musical genius, right? And that only occurs because of his collaboration with these two Black women songwriters who most folks have no knowledge. The only thing that comes close to thinking about music in this moment in terms of digital culture is a chapter that looks at Black folks and the way young Black folks have mourned in the digital realm. And I choose to do that by looking at different moments going backwards in which Black musical culture archives mourning moments. So we can talk about the Black Lives Matter moment, but let's take it back to Rodney King. Let's take it back to Martin Luther King, right? Particularly this extraordinary moment. And you find there are all these interesting moments where Black artists publicly mourn other artists in music, creating an archive, a newer archive of music. So one of the things I didn't know until I started this project, and that's a relatively blatant project, was that Sam Cooke recorded a tribute album with the album. Right? It's like, it's something that I would never have imagined, and I wouldn't suggest you listen to it because it's not very good, right? Because that's not the kind of singer that he was. But just the same way that the Supremes recorded a tribute album to Sam Cooke, right? This was a kind of ongoing process. And really with Martin Luther King's death, you have all of these artists contributing to this large archive. We know about Nina Simone, for instance, right? You know, the King is dead. But so many different other artists are memorialized in that moment. And the chapter that, you know, I kind of started talking about is Marvin Gaye and what I call the American Songbook. We love everything that Aretha did from 1967 on, right, when she became the Queen of Soul. But her archive of early recordings with Columbia Records are just simply extraordinary. And I needed to spend some time with that archive and what that work is and what she is creating in those albums, and then of course fully realizes with the Atlantic sides. It's this idea of the mastery of American music. And what I mean by that is that Aretha Franklin could sing anything. She could sing anybody, right? One of her most soulful early recordings is a cover of Hank Williams Sr., right? Who, had he lived, first of all, wouldn't have recognized the song, right? But you actually see an early glimpse into the Aretha that she would become when she signed with Atlantic. She could sing Tony Bennett. She was on the same label of Barbra Streisand. They both recorded versions of People. In 1965, Aretha's was never released until decades after she left the label, right? It was a song that introduced Barbra Streisand to a pop audience, right? The record label made a choice of who they were going to push. And of course, Barbra Streisand would go on to have opportunities that Aretha Franklin would never have, right? In terms of stage, movies, Oscar nominations, right? That was the career that Aretha wanted for herself, but the structure of the recording industry wouldn't allow, right? And then the other one was Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye does a series of recordings that are arranged by the great Bobby Scott, right? Songwriter in his own right, but more importantly, an arranger. And Bobby Scott gave Marvin Gaye 8 arrangements, 1965, 1966. Marvin Gaye begins to play with him, and he works on these 8 recordings for 25 years. And what he had always said is that, you know, when he began his career in the record industry, he wanted to be the next Frank Sinatra, right? What he wanted to record was a Black version of Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning. Itself a signature recording because it was the first time you had a male singer in Frank Sinatra really articulate a kind of emotiveness in music that largely had not been heard before. And because Frank Sinatra was who Frank Sinatra was, it resonated in a very powerful kind of way. But Marvin Gaye works on these songs for 20 years. They don't actually get fully released till after he dies, but the changes in the technology allow for the changes in the sound of his music. So the kind of rich layering that he does, right, on albums like Beginning with What's Going On and then Let's Get It On, he applies that to these Bobby Scott chunks, right? And it's just absolutely extraordinary, but it is in fact, right, an archival. And then the last chapter is really indebted to the work of filmmaker Jonah Comfort, who did a film called The Last Angel in History, which is specifically about the use of technology and what it's doing to Black music. And he creates this character called Data Thief. Right? This is 1992, before we know anything about sampling, before we know anything about streaming services and downloading music. And he talks about this character, the Data Thief, that goes back into history and steals Black sound and Black culture back from these structures. And it really is a kind of metaphor for what I wanted to do with the book, that we have this rich archive. We neither have the resources nor the inclination to do the kind of curation that needs to take place to make sure that we understand this archive. Right? You know, I love Silk Sonic. Well, I would say that's overstated. I can tolerate Silk Sonic, right? But when I hear them sing a song like Love Train, right? It's like, I've been listening to the Confunction version of this song for the last 30 years. I don't need a Silk Sonic cover up, right? But there was a whole generation of folks who's like, who's Confunction, right? And for me, that's the failure to do the kind of archival curation work that we need to do. And the book is in part, right? The crisis of us losing the archive, but also the challenge of doing kind of curation work.
Yeah. I want to thank all of you for coming. I guess I should pick a little bit this way. I want to thank you all for coming. And it's really a joy and a pleasure to sit beside you, to be in community with you. You know, as you talk about how this project prompted you to think back, I think back to the days when I was in grad school, and you know, all of the scholars that I encountered were on the pages of books, and you know, the opportunity to sit alongside, to be in conversation, and to have them really be there, to be beside another human being and to access the ideas, not just as an intellectual project, but also as a human project. Human exchange was just really exciting for me. And so this kind of ignites those same sorts of memories. So I thank you for sitting down with us this afternoon. I've got a bunch of questions, and I was so excited. I was so excited about the book. I'm teaching a class on the Black Archive. I mentioned this to you in the spring. So, you know, as I was reading, I was thinking about ideas and, you know, ways to integrate the argument and, you know, a lot of the questions and concerns that you have that you mentioned, especially toward the end, which conjures for me what Hortense Spillers talks about when she discusses Black culture as raw material and a culture that's prone to forgetting, to forgetfulness. And so what that means in the long run, the need to kind of go back and to become rooted and to document the orality, the narrative that accompanies mining the archive. So there are just lots of things. And so what I want to do in our conversation is just kind of go back through, take another walk, kind of big picture with the book and your thinking around the book and your motivations. But before we get into more of why you wrote this book, would you share what music you listened to while you were writing it?
So a lot of that depended on which part of the book I was working on. And I would create these playlists that allowed me to really go in deep when I was in a writing mode. And I only write to music. That's a big thing, right? I never really mess with Apple. So I use YouTube Music, right? Which used to be Google Music years ago because it allows you to upload your own music. So I found it real effective. But I have about 120 playlists, which are set up for me wanting to write and think in certain kind of moments and curating a kind of sound experience. But like the stats chapter, it started out a lot of Isaac Hayes. My mother loved Hot Buttered Soul, To Be Continued, Second Movement. Her Saturday morning cleaning music was those Isaac Hayes albums, right? And Isaac Hayes, right? Those albums, besides the sound of it, he did a lot of covers and rearrangements, right? Taking these kind of songs by Jerry Butler and Gamble and Butler before anybody knew who they were, but also, Bacharach and Hal David, and just rearranging them in a black sense. So that was my entry point, right? But then it meant I had to also listen to some of the other folks who were coming through there. I was so happy to write about the Soul Children. So group of not folks not know a lot of. Stax actually hasn't done a good job curating their legacy. But there's 2 female vocalists, 2 male vocalists, they all sing leads, right? And this kind of extraordinary soulful music. And the reason why I know about the Soul Children is because of RZA.
Okay.
Right. He sampled, one of their records, like, okay, who is this? Where's this sound coming from? But that chapter also meant that I had to listen to James Greene. The early stuff, right? Because I do make an argument that, he is doing an archival project, right? What he does with Peace Be Still, right? Which is a song that was written in the 1890s, right? And he recrafts it, for a Black audience. I stood on the banks of Jordan, right? Many Saturday or Sunday mornings, I would get up, crack it on. I have 2 daughters, thankfully, who are adults. But in order to be able to work, I would get up and crack it on, sitting in Starbucks at 5:30 and work for 5 hours before the rest of the day came. And there were so many mornings of James Cleveland coming on, and I stood on the banks of Jordan coming on, and me having to pause, right? Especially after my mother had passed, right? So that was one of the ways, right? Because part of the writing, the project was also for me a kind of spiritual. Listening to music that my parents listened to, and it's like I was listening with them all over again. So it changed, right? For the chapter with Ricardo Cortez Cruz, it was more of a learning curve because I had to go and figure out who these Black blues women were because it wasn't the obvious ones, right? It wasn't the Bessie Smiths and the Mamie Smiths and the Alberta Hutchins. It were really kind of obscure figures. The 3rd chapter was more of the hip hop stuff that I listened to, right? A lot of Kendrick who I write about in that chapter. And the chapter I probably spend the most time listening to was All of These on Equal Sides. The beauty of streaming services, one of the things that Universal did, they now with Motown, is that they basically would release songs that weren't released for every year. Right, beginning in the 1960s, right? You couldn't do this if it wasn't for streaming, right? Because you could just go with your songs, on an album. But so I could actually collect the multiple versions of Marvin Gaye singing these songs and actually listen to the changes from the 65 version to the 67 version. And I still, am deeply, right, embedded to that. And that particular chapter actually begins not with Marvin Gaye, Drake. Drake drops a song in 2011, we can still talk about it. He drops a song called In Marvin's Room, which always just struck me as a strange title for a song, but he recorded it in a studio that was known as Marvin's Room, right, which was Marvin Gaye's own studio in the 1970s, where a lot of this kind of layered vocal stuff that he did in this studio that he created for himself. His ex-wife, his daughter, his son talk about he had a bedroom there, he had a shower there. He basically lived in the studio when he worked there. He eventually lost it because of his taxes. But this became a space for him to explore introspection in his music. And ironically, right, if there's one contribution I would say that Drake has made, right, to hip hop, it was to bring that kind of introspective emo thing to hip hop, right? It's now, you know, misogyny and all the things it's become, in part because his willingness to be a motive early in his career queered him, right, in the context of when we think about hypermasculinity. But he was very clear in doing that song that he was tapping into this longer tradition of Marvin Gaye.
And what I like about what you just described, you know, I think about the African adage that the spirit cannot descend without song. And it's like the music you were listening to becomes this gateway for the chapters, and how it takes you, it gives you a different kind of sense of place with the richness and the texture of the sounds. It's one thing to read about Memphis and Stax. It's another thing entirely to listen to the music of the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why Black ephemera and why now?
So the title Black ephemera actually came from Jessica Marie Johnson. We co-edited a chapter of the Black Scholar, the edition of Black Scholar that 5 years ago, talking about what we call Black code studies, you know, Black dictionary studies. And in our piece that we wrote together, she throws out this term ephemera, right? She's like, you know, that's what you're talking about, you're talking about Black ephemera. And my editor book was like, okay, that's, you know, because, you know, before then, what the book was called was Big Black Data. And I make partially this argument is in the book, but this idea that Black culture to white institutions is simply data, right? To be collected and dispersed and sold and all those kinds of things. Black ephemera kind of fit better. The second part of the title, the crisis and the you know, challenge of the archive, really comes from, you know, I've been a reasonably working journalist alongside a scholar for about 25 years. Early days internet, I wrote for a site called Pop Matters. It's dropping 5, 6 album reviews, and people still do that, right? A month, right? And it's before streaming services and before all the stuff that record releases became. So I would have recordings and would have to really sit with them for 3 weeks before they were released, because they would send you stuff early to write about, right? We don't spend that kind of time on recordings anymore. And so part of the book was a response to that culture now. Hurry up and get it out there soon. Album hits at 12 midnight, people got reviews up at 12:25, and I understand you want eyeballs in every place that you write for, you know, launch content. But when it comes to Black culture, we have to carefully curate, right, what it is, right? It's not disposable. It gets treated as disposable, but it's not disposable, right? So part of the book is a challenge to say, let's get back to a place, right, where we hold on to this stuff, that it's not disposable, right? That we need to have a critical process about our music. That is as important as the art of the music in the first place, right? Those are the lessons that we learned, you know, back in the day from a historical standpoint as a scholar from folks like I in Southern America, right? That whole generation, A.B. Spelman, those whole generation of Black writers and critics who came in the 50s and 60s, right? Who treated what was produced as something that we needed to pay serious attention to, right? As a critic, you don't pay attention to it. Why should we expect the larger culture to pay attention to it?
And you know, so when we think about ephemera, you know, typically we're thinking about those, you know, the papers, the letters,
Toss away stuff, right? Just
disposable,
stuff, right?
But then the process of meaning making, when it comes to engaging with the archive, it's a process of, you know, sitting down with boxes, you're reading through, and you just have to allow the archive to speak. right? So not the easiest when you go in with a thinking you're going to cherry pick and find things to just support an argument. But this idea of assemblage that comes from work with material items in the archive. How did you translate that into the manipulation of something as immaterial as sound and music? Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I think part of it for me, like, I have a lot of colleagues and friends that are musicologists or ethnomusicologists. I don't know music very well. I don't play music. I can't read notes. My relationship to Black music is the record industry, right? For me, I would say this now. When we said this 20 years ago, what I write about is Black records, right? How they get cataloged, how they get archived, how they get produced, how they get translated, right? And transformed from one platform to the other, one medium to the other. And for me, that often comes down to, Barry Jenkins did a wonderful film about San Francisco a few years ago, before he became famous. And when he was doing this film, he would do these kind of record listening nights. And there's nothing like the crackle of a 45 record. Right? That's, once you heard that for the first time, it stays with you. And I've often been struck by record producers, particularly hip hop producers, who sample records and keep the crackles, right? Because it conveyed a sense of authenticity, right, to the practice. And so for me, that's when the material, right? How do we translate this crackle to this digital thing, right? What gets lost, right? We think about, when we think about why we love digital music, right? When CDs first hit, right? Now a foreign form for a bunch of young folks. What we talked about with CDs was that we didn't have the crackle. There wouldn't be any wear, right? The sound was pristine. But what gets lost in that transfer from the crackle to the pristine, right? And for me, that's the stuff that we want to grab at, because what that crackle says is that somebody listened to this record a lot of times, right? And there's a whole bunch of life experience with the fact that you listen to this record over and over again. When my parents had their record players, record players, right? No one had turntables. When I was a kid, you could, the way that the system was set up, you'd have the 45s for, and you could put, a dozen 45s on top of each other, right? And then you just drop down. Little difficult with albums, right? And so very often what people would end up doing would listen to the same side of an album over and over again, right? And so one side would be more worn than the other, right? But again, how do we capture what was happening in folks' lives and in the world, right? Through all that wear and tear of a record that you don't hear when you hear CD, when you don't hear when you press download, right, on one of your streaming services.
Yeah, and making me think that, my father had his records, and of course in the basement. And I remember listening to Sweet Honey in the Rock, and I listened to recordings by Nikki Giovanni. It was just, and it's only now in retrospect that I think about what I know about him through albums, through his process of curation. So, the access that we have to history through the act of curating is something that your book gets at.
Yeah.
And, this idea of the stacks, right? What you do in the first chapter, which, and I remember when library stacks, they were a place to get knowledge, but, the love and the like, it was a place, to meet up and things. So, get the book. This is, part of the title of, the first chapter. So, as I was reading that chapter, I was really struck by your sensitivity to place and how I was compelled to call, on my phone to listen to the songs that you were referencing, because I felt that, it wasn't enough just to read, that there is a soundtrack embedded within the narrative. Could you talk about why you started the book with a discussion of sex?
Yeah, because for me, what Al Bell does, he created the best argument for the valuation of Black music and Black culture. Atlantic had essentially said that this was stuff that was disposable. Right? We're not gonna buy stacks from you. We're just literally gonna take what you have, and y'all can figure out what to do next. Al Bell bet on himself and said, I have a skill set that can bring together a group of artists like the Staple Singers, right, who are these folk gospel singers. And he remakes their career. The young Rance Allen, and I have such a great story of Rance Allen. I was actually going down to the Stax Museum in 2019 to give a talk on Rance Allen, right, who's a big part of that chapter. And we're on the same floor. Right. And I'd never met him before, so just walking up to them, it's like, you don't know me, but I'm about to go talk about your music. But for me, Stax embodied everything that I wanted to talk about. That he built this enterprise from nothing that not only changed the sound of Black music. You don't get Gamble and Huck doing what Gamble and Huck did without Isaac Hayes and Al Bell doing what they did before. And the Gamble and Huck piece is important because they create the first Black boutique label, right, in Philadelphia International Records. And that's a byproduct of Al Bell valuing Black culture. This is something that is of value that we need to take care of, right, that we need to shepherd, and it's not disposable. So I just thought that was a nice kind of entry point to that story.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of value as a concept segues so nicely into the second chapter, right? Where you're talking about Black women and making legible Black women's experiences. So what I recall, especially in the mention of Cash Money Records, is going back to a really particular point in time in the 1990s, right? And where you begin to have this eruption of hip hop from areas other than New York, and you start, it's expanding your worldview, and the reference to certain colloquialisms that connect or that illuminate what New Orleans is all about. But one of the things that you do in this chapter is write against narratives of Black women that are solely about trauma and tragedy. So the question that I have for you, would you talk about how you see Kim Rivers Roberts' cinematic point of view? You talk about rejecting both the white gaze and respectability politics. How does this big picture centering of Black women show up in the Sonic Archive?
So for those who are unfamiliar, Kim Roberts is the primary protagonist in the documentary that was done after Katrina called Trouble. She basically began to gather footage she and her husband doing Katrina. They eventually connect with some filmmakers who then create a kind of film narrative about this. What struck me about, first of all, her sense of capturing it, but her narration and how she was just drawing from this rich archive. There's a moment where she's talking before the storm hits, right? And everyone's leaving. And she just starts singing Patty LaBelle's One Mile, right? And it's one of those moments in the film where, if you're watching it in a mixed group, only some of the people are going to get it, right? Where she talked about the dog that she had, right? And the dog's name was Kiss. Right, again, another one of those kind of so specific references, right? That's also about not just knowing who Kizzy is, but who Kizzy was embodied as a person, right? As this kind of repository, a connection between the Africa that was the past and the Africa that's going to go forward. And her consciousness of that herself, right? So for me, it was so important because she's using it, she's a rapper herself. Right, so she's constantly connecting the visual with the music. Location is important, right? You know, she really captures the end of a moment of New Orleans, right? And she's also present for the new moment, and she helps to narrate that also. And to read that against the narrative of Ricardo Cortez Cruz, right? She herself becomes one of these obscure blues singers in the context of this film. Right. In fact, when the film goes out and they start to promote it and it gets some nominations, she gets overlooked. Right. I cite a couple of critics, right, who dismiss her presence in the film. It's like, but no, it's her film. Right. She's telling her story. There is no film without her saying, let me take this camera and capture this stuff, right? And I have, the whole adage is out there something to say. Yes. Right. She was saying, I got something to say.
And the references to the blues, this idea of fingering the jagged grade of the blues experience, yeah, that's, and then some,
yeah.
And then some. Professor, how much time do we? Okay, well, let me just, I'm gonna jump ahead to the last question that I have. And I wanna end on this idea of the maroon. When you jump ahead, this is at the very end of the book. And thinking about what I want to do is bring the concept of maroon into conversation with Black studies as a discipline. I think about roadways, pathways, hidden routes, those who know and can get there, fortified encampments, poised for resistance. What do you see as the role of the archive to the future of Black studies?
Ooh. So that was my favorite chapter in the book. It was literally the last chapter. I don't usually write chapters in order. It was the last chapter. And it occurred after I turned in the book and my editor said to me, I think you have more to say in this last chapter. And again, the richness of intellectual exchange, right? And as I say in the book, Jessica Marie Johnson, in terms of who we are as scholars and how long we've been in the academy, folks would be apt to read her as a junior, right? But I really apprenticed with her around digital culture. And she was the one who helped me to think about the idea, what do we think about Black, right? Because, the metaphor for maroons, marronage, hidden in plain sight. Yes. It's always there, you just can't see it. It is a metaphor for Black archives, right? A history that is hidden in plain sight. We have not trained enough people to be skilled enough to recognize it, to take care of it. A lot of Black culture was never intended to be shared globally, right? It was supposed to be a little bit more deliberate, intentional. We're gonna give you a little something, right? But because we need to feed the market in order to feed our artistic genius, right? In order, some of this stuff we have to monetize. Not all of it is meant to be monetized, right? Because some of this stuff is about us and how we survive. It is not intended, right, for mass consumption. And that's where the genius of this idea of archive is maroon, where you're producing stuff, but you know how to scaffold it in a way that not everybody knows what it is. So I think about, when Ninth and I were teaching, a history hip hop class, and that moment, it's a little white girl. Which was, huh? No, hip hop. who was produced by Iggy Azalea, right? And when she hits, and there's all these folks going, oh no, it's cultural appropriation and the end of the world because Iggy Azalea is like, and I'm like, I'm not worried about Iggy Azalea appropriating lowbrow Black culture. I get concerned when we got white folks reproducing Catherine Dunham. We got white folks reproducing Duke Ellington, right? There's stuff that we give, right? It's the genius of Prince, right? Prince has this remix. He has a song called I Wish You Had. And he does this like 3-part remix of it. One of it is a rap, right? And one of the rap, he's like, take this beat, I don't mind. I got plenty others. It's so fun, right? And I love that because it was a metaphor for we will give you something. We will make a contribution, right? But some of this is about us, right? And you don't need to even know what it is. I loved 80s hip hop for a bunch of reasons, right? But in 80s hip hop, when you think about the use, the presence of the 5% nation, right? The way that local language circulated in the music. White folks are listening to hip hop in the late 1980s and have no idea what people are talking about, right? And that was part of the point, right? Yeah, you can dance to it and you can get into it, but you really don't know what we're talking about, right? The curse of Diddy and everything that comes afterwards, right, is a rap music that folks understand everything. It's like we're just giving out our secrets, right? And that was never the intention for the music, right? Y'all can have him, right? Y'all can, you can touch this and do all this kind of stuff, right? But there's also gonna be a part that y'all never gonna understand brand new. You're not gonna understand the poor righteous teachers. You weren't supposed to understand early Latino, right? There's just examples of that, which is why when we go forward to this moment and folks are talking about these mumble rappers, I'm not mad at the mumble rappers, right? Because only a few people know what the hell they're talking about. And for me, that's a good thing. Right. How do we create a culture that's going to be plain sight, right? And it's a both and proposition.
Thank you. So we'll open the floor for questions, I think. Yes.
I first want to say thank you for coming to speak with us. I guess my question is kind of twofold. So you kind of talked about the theme of like carefully curating Black art. I was one, curious to hear how like that manifests today, especially as like there's an ongoing fight for Black artists to get the rights to their masters, as well as like the comments of like way more 360 deals. And then I'm also kind of curious on the latter half, like as far as legacy of Black artists, especially once they pass away, like in terms of parents, we juice and collective memory that is developed in the pop media landscape and how their legacy can still be shaped by their estate as well as like their own vision.
Yeah, that's a great question about really intellectual property. So one of the things I think as critics we have a role is to document the culture. And if you're a working music journalist, for instance, what that means is that you just don't write about the new Beyonce. You just don't write about the new Drake album. That stuff will be covered. What is being produced that's new? That's not going to sell a million copies, right? That's not going to go viral, right, the next day. We have mistaken the record industry for Black music culture. And those are two very different things, right? Now, there are Black musical geniuses who've been successful in the record industry. There are a bunch of folks who have been successful in the record industry that I would never consider an important contribution to Black musical culture, right? And we can live with both of them, right? To give you just a sense of the ridiculousness of this, Luther Vandross never had a #1 pop single. Never. Laffy Taffy was a #1 pop song for like 3 weeks. And it's funny talking to young folks, like, when Nines and I used to co-teach this class, And we talk about what great rap music is, and all the kids are always, well, this sold 10 million copies. That's the record. That's not a contribution to the culture. That's a contribution to capitalism. So part of it is making that distinction and doing the work to pay attention to those artists who are really contributing to the culture. The challenge with that is that you actually have to have old ears. Right? And I don't mean actually to be old, but you have to have been immersed in the archive to know, right, what comes before. What's his name? Childish Gambino. Stay Woke. When that came out, everybody's like, oh my God, this is so great. Okay, it's kind of great, but it's, funkadelic. Right? Have you ever heard of Cosmic Slop? Go listen to Cosmic Slop, right? Because guess what? Childish Gambino listened the Cosmic Slop, right? And can repackage it to you, but you don't know because no one's told you that you need to know that, right? So that's part of it. The intellectual property piece in the States, right, it's a real interesting story, right? Because Black artists have not always made money off of their music. Definitely not off of their recordings, right? And for the most part, artists across the board mainly made their money too, which is why Mick Jagger and they were still out there, right, at 97 years old, right? It's in a real sense, right? It's the reason why Patti LaBelle is still doing 150 dates a year, right? It's the reason why Gladys Knight is still doing 150 dates a year. That's how they make the money, and they're taking care not just themselves, but now generations of folks in their family. People don't make money off the music. The recording industry makes money off the music, right? Courtney Love, famously described recording as Courtney Love, who's the widow of Kurt Cobain, right? Who is, controls this incredible publishing entity. She described the music industry as sharecropping, right? So if this white woman, right, who has earned hundreds of millions of dollars off of her husband's publishing, right, can describe it as sharecropping, it gives you a sense of what happens here. So people tend to make more money in debt, right, and not actual people, but corporations and folks like that. One of the things that happened that's really interesting, David Bowie, before he died, actually years before he died, partnered with this financier, created this thing that we now call Bowie bonds, which is basically selling in advance the royalties that could be generated from his catalog or his publishing, right? In the case of David Bowie, it gave him $25 million, right? And this is going back 25 years ago. Ashford and Simpson did the same thing, right? They generated $10 million, right? And this is important because, you go back 15, 20 years ago, the feel-good movie of the summer, right? You're going to hear, "Ain't a mountain high," right? They get paid, right, every time because they own publishing. You mentioned master recordings, right? It's twofold, right? Artists need to control their publishing. Artists have been better with that. Barry Gordy, right, who we know from Motown Records, and he sold Motown Records for $20 million in 1988. Right? A lot of money, but $20 million. He did not sell at the time Motown's publishing rate, Joe Bett. When he finally sold half of Joe Bett, he sold it for $300 million. Right? So the money is not always in those master recordings, but in the publishing. But the master recordings are important because every time a record company who owns the master decides to do another box set, another collection, another best of, 25th anniversary of this, right? They're basically making money off of the same resource that they paid little out to the artists in the first place, right? Which is why, Prince, for that period of time, slave and master, and folks are like, why you got slave and master in faces? Like, because if you don't know the masters, right, the master owns you, right? And Prince is a critical part of this story because he had a level of creative output that didn't keep up with the recording industry. All right, so recording industry saying you need to drop an album a year, and best case scenario, an album every 2 years, so we can squeeze some music videos. We go do a tour. Prince is like, that goes against my creativity, right? It's a Prince is literally making an album a month, right? Warner Brothers doesn't even want to release them. Warner Brothers said, here, Prince, we're going to give you $50 million up front to allow us to manage your catalog, right? And his beef from Warner Brothers came from that. He's like, I don't want your money. Right? I would change my name to something unpronounceable. So I'm not legally bound. Like his lawyer was L. Devin Miller, who I went to high school with. Right? We thought he was an interesting dude back then. I didn't know he was that interesting. And it was all about this idea of owning your own music, right? Owning the masters. When Jay-Z signed on to become president of Island Def Jam, part of the deal was that he would get the ownership of his master recording for reasonable doubt, right? Because it was something that was personally important to him. One of the few artists and the early artists to understand those politics was Ray Charles. Ray Charles in 1960 negotiated for control of his masters and his publishing. Right, Sam Cooke was in the process of getting control of his publishing, right, when he was murdered in 1964. So, yeah.
Again, thank you for being with us. As a young scholar who lives between Dr. Mark Anthony Neal and Dr. Guthrie Ramsey, what are your words of wisdom for those of us that aspire to sustain the archive and push I guess against this the scholastic upheaval about Black music? I mean, if you go in the musicology realm, the ethnomusicology, it's coming, but Dr. Portia Malsby and Alicia Lowe, they are making way. They made headway, but it's still like, what are you doing? Go sit down, Black people, right? But then when I read you and I read Dr. Ramsey, I'm like, yeah, we can do this. But then there's the question of, is it being accepted still, even in 2022?
You mentioned Ramsey, and Ramsey is my big brother, right, in the academy. We talk or text 2-3 times a week, right? Talk shit once a month when we got the time to get on the phone for an hour and a half and talk shit. But one of the lessons that I learned from him that's been manifested in his career arc, he made a decision early on that he wasn't going to choose between being a working musician and an academic. Right? He writes about this in his new book, Who Hears Here, right? That he thought it was a false choice that those who do and those who don't teach. Right? He's like, that's a false dichotomy, right? And he's gone out and written great books, but he's continued to make music, right? And it's not going to get that Beyonce heat. But ultimately, it is a contribution to something larger. Conrad Kent Rivers, poet from the 1960s, he has this poem, and I often talk about the last line of the poem, because the last line of the poem is, some Black kid is bound to reach. And for me, that has always stayed with me now for 40 years. You create, you write, you make the contribution, someone will find that contribution, right? The book I did previous to this book, Looking for Leroy, there's a chapter on Avery Brooks, and particularly his series, Hawk. And reading Avery Brooks talk about why it was important to him to get, he knew it wouldn't last more than those 13 episodes, right? He knew he was doing something so powerful that there was no way it was going to be sustainable, but they gave him a freedom in those 13 episodes. He's like, I mean, he references Howard Thurman in a television series, right? Multiple times, right? Talking about that. And I always go back to that because he said I needed to do this, it allowed me to write about it 25%, right? Because when I watched it in 1989, I was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know how to talk about it, but I'm gonna find a way, right? And so do the work. Someone will find the work, right? Someone will do beautiful things with the work, right? Someone will speak back to your work, and in the base case scenario, with you there to be able to do that.
Join me in thanking Mark Anthony Neal and Shanna Greene